This is Voices for Climate, the podcast where people who are making a difference in climate change and sustainability speak out for our planet. If you're looking for honest conversations, bold ideas, and real climate solutions, you're in the right place. My name is Arnav, and today we're joined by Craig, a climate and democracy expert with an expertise in environmental law. He recently served as Senior Vice President at Evergreen Action, where he advanced pro climate and pro democracy policies, and before that, as Deputy Executive Officer at the California Air Resources Board, leading major initiatives like zero-emission vehicle standards and environmental justice programs. Today, he advises governments, NGOs, universities, and other foundations on effective climate policies. Craig, it's great to have you here.
I'm pleased to be here. Thanks for doing what you're doing.
Yeah, so to start off, can you kind of dive deeper into your journey for us? Like, what drew you to climate law and governance in the first place, and how did that lead to your various roles as an attorney, policy leader, and government official?
Sure. Well, I got started as a field ecologist in college, studying snowpacks that were melting in the high Rockies. And what became really clear to me was that this was a society-wide problem, reaching even, to remote peaks at 12 or 13,000 feet, and that I was a fairly lousy field ecologist. So I wound up thinking it would be a better idea to go to law school and get involved. This was in the early sort of Bush-Cheney years, back when America was planning to build hundreds of coal-fired power plants. And so I was involved in the early efforts to get the U.S. climate movement on its first footing. So challenging coal-fired power plants around the country, working with other lawyers to get out early climate reports and the like. And from there, I've been lucky enough to be part of the movement going forward. So got to spend time setting California's policies, thinking through federal policies, and now sort of thinking both locally and globally on what we do in this very strange period of rollbacks and escalating climate change.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And so, you've advised governments from California all the way to the Falkland Islands. And so, what motivates you to take on such diverse climate roles, and how have your experience varied in different places?
So, yeah, I'm delighted you know about the Falklands experience. Those penguins will be getting clean energy shortly. So, in brief, I just think this is a core human endeavor. A lot of climate work gets framed as this technology problem, and it's true that matters. But at core, I'm really motivated by people like Eleanor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize for some of her work on this area, who said this is sort of this polycentric, multi-layered puzzle that's about social change. And I can think of little more important, both in terms of the degree of human suffering we can avoid by working on these issues, um, and from the interest of trying to create an entirely new global energy system and what that implies for the global order. So I've really enjoyed thinking, yes, about California's programs and policies and the federal governments. But the Falklands are fascinating too. They're trying to figure out how to decarbonize a nation of 3,000 people that's like the size of Wales, that's wildly isolated, and help them think through what's now their path to clean energy strategy that courtesy Donald Trump, I think, is now more aggressive than the U.S. is. So you sort of have to think work at every level at once. And it didn't hurt that my then year and a half old got to chase king penguins down a beach, of course, at a safe, appropriate distance.
That's great to hear. I like the way you put it. That's kind of a multi-layered puzzle. So, I wanted to ask you more about your experience at the California Air Resources Board. You mentioned you helped pass the world's most comprehensive zero-emission vehicle rules. So, what lessons did that teach you about, turning ambitious climate policy into a reality?
I think I learned too, because I also saw many of those rules get rolled back this year by the current Senate. The one thing I learned is that there really is room for large scale system change. I mean, those rules, the Advanced Clean Cars program, became a global model. So it wasn't just, and that is still true, even as the US recedes. So the first thing I've learned is that getting policy enacted, even at the subnational level, has global consequences. And it really begins changing these whole industrial supply chains. The other thing I've learned is that one set of policies is rarely enough. Even in California, this policy has been so successful that we're now something in the order of 1 in 5 or 1 in 4 new cars on the road is an EV, and that's growing despite headwinds. But also, we're now having to manage just transitions at the refineries and oil fields. So one of the things that I think I've really learned is that you have to keep expanding the aperture. This is not the same problem as, say, putting in filters on smokestacks or tailpipes. That's where you begin. But where you go now is how you help carry the whole of society over. And that helps make those policies more durable, even when you lose one tactic. We'll be back with more rules, I'm sure. But hopefully, we also have a much broader technology base and a much broader social base for the next steps.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so, you kind of mentioned sort of the current political state, especially as it interacts with climate change and climate rules. So, can you maybe elaborate? Do you see kind of the risks of climate policy and how political polarization undermines that? Does that affect your work, and how do we guard against that?
Sure. So what we've clearly seen, I think this is somewhat dead enderism, is the current administration decide to wed itself to fossil fuel and to chip away at just bedrock elements of U.S. climate policy. I think there are two things you can take from that. The first is that, of course, a lot of this isn't going to work for the same reason that you couldn't just call a whole clean energy economy into play with one rule if you wanted to. You also can't drag us all back to horse and buggy if you'd like to, and especially in a context in which globally, I mean, China's at something like almost half new sales are EVs this year, and is building more solar in a month than we build in a year. This isn't close in terms of where the world is going, but it does mean that we need to figure out ways to sort of broaden the base. So I'll offer two things. First, I think it's really striking that even with a trifecta Republican control, we actually didn't lose the whole Inflation Reduction Act, the big federal policies that invest in clean energy. We lost parts of that, but part of that was over arguments that solar and wind were now so mature they didn't need subsidies. So there's actually a much broader consensus than people think in terms of making progress. The other thing to say is there are lots of ways to make progress that are actually not politically coded. For instance, Texas is a real clean energy leader because they've really amplified permitting efforts to just make it very easy to install energy on their grid in a way California, for instance, hasn't. So I think there's a chance to learn from across the spectrum folks on how you both create, yes, the traditionally more blue regulatory approaches for certainty, but also the traditionally more red financing and streamlining approaches to sort of make that certainty stick, while also thinking about how you embed it in communities that get under thought about. E.g., if we really want this to politically accelerate, has to benefit people in the Central Valley of California or neglected urban areas or in urban cores in ways that it hasn't. And that's available, but it requires conscious policy. So I am dispirited by this wave of really knee-jerk, burn it down stuff we're seeing, but I'm also seeing it begin to peter out functionally while the rest of the actual economy rolls forward in and around it. So I'm hopeful that we'll be actually be able to build really well, both in states and cities, and then federally again in the pretty near future.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. And so, you also mentioned before how you were part of lawsuits kind of during the Trump era back in his first administration. And so, can you talk to us more about those experiences and how do you see those lawsuits kind of like playing roles in protecting environmental progress? Any like lessons
Sure.
from those?
So I was, as the assistant chief counsel for the California Air Board, I was involved in a bunch of different multi-state suits, often as the plaintiff or petitioner, over Trump wind rollbacks. That's continued. I think the current California AG has already probably sued more than 100 times just in the last few months. What we learned from that is that a lot of these efforts are pretty legally unstable because the facts do, in general, still matter in the law. It's very hard to use a statute like the Clean Air Act that mandates best technologies and clean air practices to roll back those efforts. So we've seen more of a shock and awe campaign from the Trumpies and um, administration too, where they've just done more wildly illegal things more quickly. And they've definitely lost some big, important pieces of our system. I'm not sure that those big rollbacks will prove to be stable. What I learned from them last time is a lot of that was contrary to law. They're losing quite a lot now too. And more to the point, I think it's also about how we rebuild, which is both putting some of this back in place. But the other piece I learned is you sometimes have to decide that some of these fights, you still want to win them, but you can do better. E.g., I'm really pleased that we maintained a lot of the EPA systems. Um, this time, when we rebuild federal policy, perhaps we should build beyond EPA, given that we've had a lot of this regulatory to and fro in litigation, and try to figure out how we just get steel in the ground in a lot of different communities through fiscal policy or energy or commerce. And then also add pollution rules, but think about the broader suite of pieces. In other words, you don't want to just be litigating. There's a lot more you can do.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And so also kind of, following on to your experiences both with like in terms of the legal field, but also back in, with California, how have you in your work kind of ensured that climate policy is also equitable, right? Especially in kind of communities that are maybe more impacted by things like pollution, but are less represented.
One thing I was really pleased to get to work with the team at Carbon was the Office of Community Air Protection, which is among the first major programs in any big U.S. state to engage communities directly in applying for clean air programs funded by millions of dollars in grants. And that's really helped to rebalance power relationships. That program's ongoing. It is not enough on its own. You also need to get pretty significantly big investments in land use changes and other layers of government. But it speaks to how one can manage that. And you saw that in the Biden period too, where almost all the big investments were paired with community benefit plans and the like. So I think all that
Mhm.
needs sizing up. But I'd also say that it's worth thinking about this from the economic side directly too. We talk a lot about investing in disadvantaged communities. The better path is to make sure communities aren't disadvantaged. So I think a broader based program around, so for instance, in California, rebalancing our very often really up and down state budget and thinking about ways to invest in regions more durably really matters. So yes, I think we need more programs like community air protection, but also I would just love to see, for instance, in the communities that are now dependent on oil and gas, real efforts just at economic diversification, period. So they're not tied to fossil fuels in ways that limit people to good jobs only at oil fields or refineries. We should protect and honor those energy workers. We should also figure out ways to have broader options going forward.
Hmm. That makes sense. Yeah. And so, your profile, you also mentioned how you're kind of like climate, you talk about climate change and democracy, and you kind of talk about how climate change and democracy are linked. And so, can you explain to us why you like protecting democratic institutions is so essential for climate action?
Yes. So what we've seen is that autocracy and environment protect and failures to protect the environment go together. If you don't have clear democratic channels of dissent, you wind up with basically ring fencing of resources, whether it's fossil or in the case of people like Elon Musk, clean tech, in ways that don't benefit ordinary people. It's really important that we don't see this as just a technocratic policy switch or swap out one energy system for the other with the same basic logics. Now, I'm not saying here that people shouldn't be able to get rich off clean energy. They should. It's actually important that we have a market motivator here. But we do need to figure out ways to link that to broad scale democratic decision making, community benefit, both for environmental outcomes and also for durability. So I think, especially as we get into the mid century, we'll see really challenging climate impacts that we'll have to navigate. We'll want to avoid scenarios in which we see the rich sort of secede from society. We've already seen these horrible anti-immigration policies, which are rooted in part in fears over climate disruption. The right response to that is broad scale social organizing, deep investment in communities, and a clean energy transition. But they go together. You really can't sort of have one without the other.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And then, now thinking internationally, kind of beyond the US, what role do you see moving forward the United States playing in kind of global climate change planning and policies and things like that?
In the near term, what I think we'll see are networks of subnational jurisdictions working together in ways that they can. So sharing knowledge, exporting policy to each other, making sure that the vast chunks of emissions controlled by states and cities continue to decline, and that policies that can benefit ordinary people and be democracy reinforcing are shared across these borders. Just as we've seen international sort of autocratic movement from Putin to Trump to Modi move things forward on the right, we need shared efforts on the left to maintain that. And I hope the US steps back into that frame. Sadly, one thing our allies will have learned from us is we can go through really radical policy swings. I'm hopeful when we recover from this era, we see real efforts to stabilize US democracy and democratic policy, which will help the US re-engage in climate spaces. But the really key thing now is to recognize that those answers stem from every level of our society. So the US, leaders in the US can still lead and support climate action um, and build a frame, I think, for the US to re-engage going forward.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And then my last question to you now is, from your perspective, what do you think youth especially can do to kind of help with influencing climate policy or governance?
I think that youth have proven, whether at its youth climate movements or youth engaging in technology development in their cities and federally, exceptionally important. There is sometimes this unfortunate tendency to treat young people as naive or disengaged or just tell them to go recycle or something. I think that's exactly wrong. What is instead true is that most social society changing movements begin on high school and college and grad school campuses and should. So I think young people should actively engage to demand affirmative leadership from their leaders. We've seen a lot of accommodationism this cycle. We've seen folks eager to explain why it's not realistic to have large scale change. And one of the huge values of young people is they come to these problems fresh and can insist on substantial change. So that means organizing, yes, but it also means engaging, I think, really directly in politics. People tend to, I think, over focus on the federal government. But there's huge value considering how much, for instance, in California, where we both are, forcing upzoning and urban infill matters in good transit to reducing the majority of the state's emissions there and vastly improving people's lives. I would let me tell one brief story. I was recently at a meeting about upzoning a tiny chunk of Berkeley, and I was one of the youngest people in that room, even though I'm in my 40s. There were well over 100 people there. I think there were 5 people under 50. And that's because, of course, people have been zoned out of affordable housing all across California. It's really important that young people show up and insist that they be represented too at those meetings at the local government level and counterbalance folks who might want stasis, want less aggressive policies, want policies inconsistent with our shared futures. And I think there's a huge ability to change the world there. perceived the world as not that malleable. I think when I was probably 18 or 19 or 20, I thought things were kind of set, but I think it's really malleable. It's surprisingly possible to open a door and move forward on these issues. And it's certainly true in regional governments. So I think there's just a huge scope of activity that people can engage in that is not, the junior table, but is in fact the core of climate response.
Yeah, yeah. And just as a follow-up, specifically for young people interested in combining like law and policy, kind of as you have done in your background, with climate change and advocacy, what advice would you give to those people?
I think engaging early in how government really works matters. There's and using sort of novel tools to get at its workings. People, and that includes, I think, literally just going and meeting council members and officials. People are relatively good now, I think, at tuning out social media campaigns, important though they are, or not sort of assuming that, but just showing up in the mayor's office and really working concretely for change is just valuable. The sooner you have real chops in delivering big change, the better. And a lot of that is just going and doing it. There's just so much room to go try interesting things and move genuine policy solely through presence and showing up. And that matters far more than experience.
Yeah, yeah. That's such amazing advice, and I think such a powerful note to end on. So, Craig, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your experience and insights. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so that's all we have today on Voices for Climate. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow the show and share it with someone who cares about building a more sustainable future. And I'll see you all next time. Thank you.